It's been the worst time of my life, Joe. If somebody accused me of raping them or hurting them, I have a 22-year-old daughter. I would never hurt anyone.
There are moments in Hollywood that stop everything. Moments when the phone calls dry up, when the scripts stop arriving, when the name that once opened doors suddenly becomes the name that closes them. For Clifton Powell, one of the most distinctive and dependable character actors of his generation, that moment did not arrive through a single dramatic event. It crept in slowly, built from accusations, courtrooms, financial wreckage, personal heartbreak, and an industry that never truly waited for the full story before writing its own ending. And now, with the final chapter of his legal saga confirmed and closed, the question hanging over Hollywood is both simple and devastating. Is this goodbye forever? This is not a story about a guilty man facing justice. This is a story about what happens when the machinery of public opinion, legal battles, industry politics, and personal struggle converge on a single human being at the same time. It is a story about how a man who climbed out of one of the toughest neighborhoods in America, who built a career with over 100 credits to his name, who stood shoulder to shoulder with Hollywood's finest, can find himself watching everything he built slowly dissipate. Clifton Powell's sentence is final, but the sentence was never handed down by a judge. It was handed down by something far more powerful and far less merciful. Let's get into it. To understand what has been lost, you first have to understand what was built. Clifton Powell was not handed anything. He was not the product of a privileged upbringing, a well-connected family, or the kind of early breaks that smooth the path for so many in the entertainment world. He was born and raised in Southeast Washington, D.C., a part of the city that has historically been defined by economic hardship, limited opportunity, and the kind of daily struggle that either breaks a person or forges something unbreakable in them. For Powell, it forged something unbreakable. He lost his mother when he was just 4 years old. 4 years old, at an age when most children are learning the names of colors and discovering the world through play. Clifton Powell was already navigating a world that had taken away one of the two people he needed most. His father, left to raise him alone, struggled with alcoholism, and the stability that every child deserves was simply not available in that household. Powell grew up surrounded by friends and peers who were pulled into gang life, criminal activity, and paths that led nowhere good. The statistics alone should have predicted a very different life for him. But something inside Powell refused to accept that prediction. He found acting, and when he found it, he devoted himself to it with the kind of single-minded intensity that only comes from knowing what the alternative looks like. He trained, he worked, he showed up, and he refused to let the limitations of his circumstances define the ceiling of his ambition. By the time the 1990s arrived, Powell had positioned himself on the edge of something real. His breakthrough came with Menace to Society in 1993, a film that hit American audiences like a thunderclap. It was raw, unflinching, and brutally honest about the realities of urban life in a way that Hollywood had rarely attempted. Powell's performance in that film announced him as someone who understood that authenticity in front of the camera cannot be faked. You either bring it or you don't. He brought it. Directors noticed. Casting agents started keeping his name on their lists. And from there, the career began to build itself. The Friday franchise made him a household face, if not always a household name. His comedic timing was a revelation to people who had only seen him in dramatic roles. He could pivot from menace to laughter within the same sentence, within the same look, and audiences responded to that rare gift. He followed that with appearances in Dead Presidents, Rush Hour, Why Do Fools Fall in Love, Next Friday, and dozens of other projects that cemented his status as one of Hollywood's most versatile and reliable performers. Over the span of 3 decades, he accumulated more than 100 credits, which is a number that most working actors never reach, and that speaks to both his skill and his professionalism. But the crowning achievement of his career, the moment that placed him among the truly respected, came in 2004 with Ray. The biographical film about Ray Charles starred Jamie Foxx in a performance that would win him an Academy Award, and Powell was right there alongside him, playing Jeff Brown, Ray Charles' fiercely loyal road manager. His portrayal was layered, human, and deeply felt, earning him a nomination for an NAACP Image Award and placing him in a conversation about serious acting talent that his industry had sometimes been reluctant to have about him. In Ray, Powell proved something that the system had tried to obscure, that given the right material and the right platform, he was capable of work that transcended categorization. That was Clifton Powell at his peak. That was what was at stake when everything began to fall apart. In the late summer of 2011, a woman came forward with accusations against Clifton Powell that would alter the course of his life permanently. The woman, who used the pseudonym Keontae Mayers and worked as a cocktail waitress in New Orleans, alleged that an encounter between herself and Powell in a hotel room had begun consensually but had then crossed a line when she asked him to stop and he allegedly ignored her. The accusation was serious, specific, and devastating in its implications. Powell denied the claims completely and immediately. Through his representatives, he stated clearly and unequivocally that the accusations were false, that he had done nothing wrong, and that he intended to defend himself through every legal avenue available to him. But by the time his denial reached the public, the headline had already done its work. TMZ and other outlets ran the story with the kind of blunt, declarative framing that leaves little room for nuance or presumption of innocence. His name was attached to the accusation in search engines, in social media conversations, and in the minds of producers and studio executives who had no patience for the complexity of an unresolved legal matter. The original criminal investigation was dismissed due to insufficient evidence. There was no arrest, no charge, no trial. In the eyes of the law, the matter had been examined and found lacking in the foundation necessary to proceed. For any reasonable observer, that outcome should have mattered. It should have provided at least a partial restoration of his standing. But Hollywood does not operate on legal reasoning. Hollywood operates on perception, on marketability, on the question of whether associating with a particular name will help a project or hurt it. And in 2011, Clifton Powell's name had become a risk that studios were not willing to take. The accuser then pursued a civil case, seeking financial damages exceeding $75,000. The civil legal standard, known as the preponderance of evidence, operates very differently from the criminal standard of beyond a reasonable doubt. In a civil case, the question is simply whether it is more likely than not that the plaintiff's version of events is accurate. This lower threshold meant that Powell remained legally vulnerable even after the criminal investigation had closed without charges. The civil case dragged on for years, consuming his finances, his time, his emotional energy, and his professional momentum simultaneously. What followed was a slow-motion dismantling of everything he had spent decades building. Roles he had been promised evaporated without explanation. Television projects that should have extended his career were quietly restructured to minimize or eliminate his involvement. He spoke publicly about one particular television show where he had expected to appear in 7 or 8 episodes only to find himself written out after 2, with producers unwilling to commit to an actor whose name carried a cloud of controversy. The message from the industry was clear even when it was never stated directly. Until this is resolved, and perhaps even after, you are a liability. The civil case was ultimately thrown out in 2017, with the court finding insufficient evidence to support the claims against him. Powell's own counterclaims for defamation and emotional distress were dismissed in 2018, closing the legal chapter entirely. He had not been found guilty of anything. He had been examined by the legal system and emerged without a conviction, without a judgment against him, without any formal finding of wrongdoing. By every legal measure, he was a man who had been falsely accused and had survived the process with his innocence intact. But innocent is not the same as unharmed, and the years between the accusation and the final resolution had cost him something that no court ruling could restore. There is a particular kind of punishment that exists outside the legal system, one that courts cannot impose and therefore cannot lift. It is the punishment of public perception, of being mocked before the evidence is heard, of carrying an association that follows you regardless of what the facts eventually reveal. Clifton Powell experienced this punishment in full, and the cruelty of it lies in the fact that it was handed down by the very world he had given his career to. When the accusations first surfaced, Powell was at a stage of his career where momentum and consistency were everything. He was not a young actor still building his foundation. He was a seasoned professional with a proven track record, someone who had earned the right to expect that his work would speak for itself. Instead, he found himself in the position of having to justify his entire existence to an industry that had already decided the calculus. The risk of standing by him was too high. The reward of his talent was not high enough to outweigh the potential backlash. And so, quietly and efficiently, the industry moved on without him. Powell described the emotional reality of this period in terms that reveal how profoundly it affected him. He compared the pain to the loss of his father, which gives you some sense of what he was carrying. Here was a man who had already known real grief, who had grown up with real hardship, comparing the experience of being abandoned by his industry to one of the most profound losses a person can endure. He spoke about walking down the street and feeling the suspicion in strangers' eyes. He spoke about what it meant to have his children exposed to headlines that painted him as something he knew himself not to be. The financial losses were significant, but they were measurable and potentially recoverable. The loss of dignity, of trust, of the easy professional confidence that comes from knowing your reputation is solid, that loss was of a different order entirely. Hollywood's response to his situation illustrated something about the industry that Powell himself had long understood but perhaps had hoped might work differently in his case. The entertainment business does not wait for verdicts. It waits for clarity of image, for the absence of complication, for the assurance that an actor's personal life will not overshadow the film being promoted or the series being sold to advertisers. Powell's situation was the opposite of Clay. It was complicated in exactly the ways that make studio executives nervous and network programmers cautious. And so the sentence was administered not through any formal process but through the accumulated weight of unanswered phone calls, canceled meetings, and opportunities that quietly went to someone else. The phrase final sentence carries a particular resonance in his story because it speaks to something that has not been resolved by the legal outcome. Yes, the courts cleared him. Yes, the civil case was thrown out. But the sentence handed down by the court of public opinion was written in a different kind of ink, and whether it can truly be erased remains one of the central questions of his legacy. The legal ordeal was not the only battle Clifton Powell was fighting throughout his career. Beneath the surface of his Hollywood journey ran a current of discrimination that he has spoken about with remarkable candor and specificity, a discrimination rooted not just in race but in the shade of his skin. Colorism, the preference for lighter skin tones within communities of color, has been a persistent and damaging force in the entertainment industry for as long as the industry has existed. Powell encountered it directly and repeatedly throughout his career. He recalled specific instances where casting decisions were made not on the basis of his talent, his range, or his proven ability to deliver, but on the basis of his complexion. Producers told him he was too dark for a role. Network executives suggested, in language that reveals the depth of the bias, that his skin tone might make viewers uncomfortable or even frightened. These were not ancient memories from the early days of his career. They were recurring experiences that shaped the kinds of roles he was considered for and the kinds of roles that were quietly steered elsewhere. The particular cruelty of this discrimination is the contradiction at its heart. Powell was frequently praised and cast in roles that required physical authority, menace, or intimidation. His dark complexion, which was apparently a barrier when it came to roles requiring sympathy or romantic appeal, was suddenly an asset when the role called for someone to represent threat or danger. The industry was essentially communicating two things simultaneously: that his appearance was too dark to be loved by a mainstream audience, but dark enough to be feared by one. This double standard confined him to a specific range of archetypes while closing off the kinds of roles that might have elevated his status from respected character actor to genuine leading man. Powell's response to this discrimination was not silence. He spoke about it, named it, and refused to pretend it did not exist. He also extended his concern for equity to the black entertainment community itself, calling out what he saw as a destructive tendency to tear each other down in public forums, particularly in mainstream media that was already inclined to minimize black achievement. His very public disagreement with director Spike Lee, which arose from comments Lee made about a fellow black entertainer, revealed Powell's commitment to solidarity even at the cost of being unpopular. He made clear that he did not respect anyone who would go to crossover press to undermine a fellow black performer who was simply trying to succeed in a business that was already difficult enough. This was not a popular position to take, and it cost him relationships, but it was consistent with a worldview built on the understanding that shared struggle requires shared loyalty. The NAACP Image Award nomination for Ray represented something beyond professional recognition for Powell. It was a moment of validation from within a community that understood what he had been navigating, an acknowledgement that his work carried weight and meaning beyond the limited framework that Hollywood's biases had tried to impose on him. The nomination placed him alongside performers whose contributions were measured not by how closely they conformed to Eurocentric beauty standards, but by the truth and depth of what they brought to their roles. For Powell, that recognition mattered in ways that perhaps could not be fully articulated, because it spoke to the part of his journey that had been most quietly and persistently wounded. Yet the nomination could not undo the systemic architecture that had shaped his career. The barriers were structural, embedded in the decisions of people with the power to greenlight projects and cast leads, people whose biases often operated below the level of conscious awareness. Powell fought those barriers with every role he took, every performance he delivered, and every time he refused to disappear quietly when the industry suggested he should. But fighting a system from the inside, while also managing a career, a personal life, and eventually a legal crisis, is an exhausting and often losing proposition. Beyond the cameras and the courtrooms, Clifton Powell's life was marked by private struggles that rarely made the headlines but shaped the man profoundly. The wounds of his childhood, the early loss of his mother, the instability of his upbringing, the constant proximity to danger and despair, did not simply disappear when he became successful. They traveled with him into adulthood, finding new expressions in the choices he made and the vulnerabilities he carried. He married, built a family, and for a time appeared to have constructed the stable home that his childhood had denied him. But the demands of Hollywood are not compatible with the demands of domestic life in any simple way, and Powell has spoken openly about how his devotion to his career pulled him away from his family in ways that he would later deeply regret. The travel, the long shoots, the gravitational pull of an industry that operates around the clock, all of it conspired to make him an absent presence in his own home. He reflected later that being gone 70% of the time was simply too much, that the financial provision he offered could not substitute for the physical and emotional presence his children needed. The marriage ended, and the divorce cost him an estimated $5 million, a sum that represented not just financial loss but the price of decisions made when ambition and temptation outweighed everything else. Powell has also been candid about his gambling habit, describing years in which he regularly lost between $30,000 and $50,000 annually at casinos. For someone at the peak of a successful acting career, those numbers might seem manageable. But over time, combined with the financial devastation of his divorce and the loss of income that followed the accusations and the resulting professional fallout, the accumulated damage was severe. He also acknowledged the corrosive influence of the social environment that fame creates, the fake friends, the people drawn to access and resources rather than to genuine connection, the women whose interest was inseparable from what he could provide. The lifestyle that appeared glamorous from the outside was, from the inside, a series of transactions that left him increasingly isolated and increasingly exposed. What makes Powell's story particularly affecting is the gap between the exterior and the interior. On screen and at public appearances, he projected strength, charisma, and confidence. He was Clifton Powell, the man with over 100 credits, the NOC-nominated performer, the actor who had shared scenes with Jamie Foxx and held his own. But behind that projection was a man carrying enormous weight, a man whose finances were precarious, whose personal life had fractured, whose industry had turned its back on him during his most difficult hours, and who was trying to hold together a sense of self against considerable pressure. This is the full picture that the final sentence demands we look at. Not just the accusation that was ultimately dismissed, not just the colorism that limited his opportunities, not just the gambling and the divorce and the fake friends. All of it together. The complete human story of someone who deserved better from the systems and structures that shaped his world. So what does it mean to say goodbye forever to Clifton Powell? Is this truly the end? Or is it something more complicated? The legal battle is over. That chapter is closed. The courts found insufficient evidence to support the accusations against him, and the civil case that followed was thrown out entirely. By any legal measure, Powell walks away from this process as a man who was accused, fought, and survived without a conviction. That matters. It should matter more than it apparently does to the industry that still views him with hesitation. But it matters. What lingers is the question of recovery. Hollywood's relationship with redemption is selective and often more closely tied to commercial value than to moral reasoning. Actors who generate significant box office returns find that the industry's forgiveness is remarkably swift and comprehensive. Actors whose greatest strength was their reliability and their versatility in supporting and character roles face a steeper climb, because there is no single box office number to point to as evidence that the risk of re-engagement is worth taking. Powell falls into the second category, and that makes his path forward considerably more uncertain. But career uncertainty is not the same as a goodbye forever. Powell is still a working actor. His skills have not diminished. His ability to command a scene, to bring authenticity and depth to a character, to make an audience believe in the person on the screen, none of that has been taken from him. What has been taken is time, momentum, financial security, and the uncomplicated professional reputation that he spent decades building. Those are real losses, and it would be dishonest to minimize them. But they are not the same as the permanent end of a career and a life. The deeper goodbye, if there is one, is the goodbye to a version of Hollywood that Powell had hoped might operate differently. The goodbye to the expectation that talent and hard work would ultimately be sufficient protection against the forces of bias, rumor, and institutional abandonment. The goodbye to the faith that the industry he had given his professional life to would extend him the same loyalty he had extended to it. In that sense, yes, something is ending. Something has already ended. But Clifton Powell is still here. He survived Southeast Washington. He survived the loss of his mother at 4 years old. He survived decades of colorism and systemic bias. He survived a legal ordeal that would have destroyed many people and did, in important ways, nearly destroy him. If his story tells us anything, it tells us that survival is something this man knows how to do. Hollywood will move on, as it always does. New stories will capture attention. New scandals will displace old ones. New faces will replace those who fell from favor. That is the nature of an industry built on the constant hunger for the next thing. But the story of Clifton Powell deserves to be remembered and understood in its full complexity, not as a cautionary tale about personal failing, not as a simple narrative of downfall and disgrace, but as a case study in what happens when a talented, flawed, resilient human being is subjected to the overlapping pressures of public accusation, systemic bias, personal struggle, and institutional abandonment all at once. The sentence is final, but the man is not finished, and the truth of what he endured is more complicated, more instructive, and more worth understanding than any headline has yet managed to convey. That is Clifton Powell's story. That is why it matters. And that is why, even now, even after everything, it would be too soon to say goodbye forever.